When we talk about the really immense challenges facing global biodiversity, biological invasions, well, they're right up there at the top.
Absolutely. The numbers alone are pretty staggering.
Yeah, I mean, we're looking at costs globally hitting, what, over US $1.3 trillion in recent decades?
And even more starkly, invaders are linked to something like 60% of known plant and animal extinctions.
60%.
Yeah,
That really puts the gravity of the problem into perspective, doesn't it?
it really does. And if we're going to manage that kind of risk, if we want to set up, effective defenses and policies, we absolutely have to be able to predict where an invasive species might land and actually thrive.
And that predictive power, it seems to rest on a really fundamental assumption.
It does. The idea that the environmental needs of a species, what we call its ecological niche, stays pretty much the same when it moves from its native home to some new region.
So basically, we assume a species that likes, say, warm, salty water with certain nutrients in its native range will hunt for those exact same conditions if it invades somewhere else.
That's the standard assumption, yes.
But the big question is, does that stability really hold up over the long haul, especially in places like the ocean, which are so dynamic? That feels like the core tension here.
That's precisely the question that guided this major new study we're diving into. It's led by Chunlong Liu, and the title is Dynamic Environmental Niches of Marine Invasive Species Over 200 Years.
Okay.
And their mission was, well, incredibly ambitious. They wanted to move past the usual snapshots, maybe 10 or 20 years of invasion history, and really quantify how these environmental niches evolve over 2 whole centuries.
2 centuries. And the scope is just, frankly, breathtaking. For this deep dive, we're digging into their findings based on an analysis covering 778 global marine invaders.
That's right. A huge range of organisms, algae, invertebrates, fishes, using occurrence data that, incredibly stretches back 200 years.
Wow. Okay, let's unpack this a bit. For you, the listener, maybe you're involved in management or policy. Why is this assumption of niche stability, this idea that the past predicts the future, why is it so critical?
Well, it's really the foundation of our predictive tools. Environmental managers, they rely heavily on these niche-based models to map out potential risk zones.
Okay.
And for these models to actually work, you need that implicit stability assumption to hold water. If the environmental drivers, things like temperature, salinity in the native range, reliably predict where the species will pop up in the introduced range, well, then management becomes feasible. You kind of know where to build the metaphorical fences.
But as we know, the second an organism lands somewhere new, the context changes completely, right?
Yeah.
The old rules might not apply.
Precisely. That moment of introduction. It's often driven by factors that have almost nothing to do with how well-suited the environment is. Things like human transport.
You mean like propagule pressure?
Exactly, propagule pressure. The sheer number of individuals arriving or how often they arrive, say, from cargo ships dumping ballast water that can just overwhelm strict environmental suitability, at least initially.
So the organisms basically land where the boats drop them off, not necessarily where the environment is a perfect match. That initial foothold seems driven more by chance, or what scientists call stochasticity. That's a good way to put it. Driven by stochasticity. And you see, if that initial establishment is kind of random, then the species has two options. Adapt quickly to survive in maybe a less than ideal environment, or slowly spread out until it finds a place that does match its historical niche. Which brings us back to the time frame.
Exactly. That's why looking at niche change over years or decades, the typical time frame for policy decisions is so vital. We desperately need to know if those historical patterns ever become predictive within those shorter management windows.
Okay, so if that stability assumption might be shaky, then how you measure the change becomes absolutely crucial. How did Liu and the team track these dynamic niche shifts across almost 800 species in 2 centuries?
They used what's really considered the gold standard framework for this. It's known as the COUE scheme. COUE.
Right.
Yeah. This method basically takes the total environmental space available to a species across both its native and introduced ranges and breaks it down very rigorously into 3 measurable parts.
Okay, let's define those clearly because you said these are core to the findings.
Definitely. First up is stability S. This is the environmental space that's overlapped. So environments that are similar to the historical niche and are occupied in both the native and introduced ranges. If niche stability is strong, this S value should be high.
Got it. Stability is the overlap. And then the other 2 components show the change or the sort of incompleteness.
Correct. Second is unfilling. That's the environmental space occupied only in the native range. It essentially means there's suitable habitat out there in the introduced range that the species just hasn't gotten to yet. Maybe because it can't disperse there easily, or maybe it just hasn't had enough time.
Okay, unfilling is potential habitat not yet reached. And finally, expansion, E.
Expansion is really critical. That's the environmental space occupied only in the introduced range. This is the real signal of change. It shows the species is surviving, maybe even thriving, in totally novel environmental conditions it never used back home.
Perhaps because its old enemies, predators, or competitors got left behind.
Exactly. Those historical constraints are gone, potentially opening up new environmental possibilities.
And to track this over time, they used a 50-year moving window analysis. That's where that 200-year data set really comes into play, right? You're not just comparing the start and end points, but how the niche shifts decade by decade.
Precisely. It gives you that dynamic picture.
But hang on, we are talking about occurrence records from like the 1800s sometimes.
Yeah.
How much faith can we really put in data gathered back then compared to the satellite data we have now?
That's a very fair question and a critical one. The researchers definitely acknowledge potential observational biases in those older records, fewer records from remote places, maybe tropical areas were undersampled.
Sure.
However, the real strength of this study is its sheer volume 778 species and that dynamic approach. By averaging patterns across hundreds of species and using consistent modern environmental data as the baseline for defining the niches, they argue they can capture the persistent, large-scale ecological signals that kind of outweigh the noise from individual, maybe spotty historical records.
Okay, so the scale helps overcome some of the noise. Still, we have to remember that this environmental niche is a complex thing. They use 9 key predictors.
Yeah, 9 predictors covering a range sea surface temperature, nutrient levels like nitrates and phosphates, salinity, even physical factors like water depth or bathymetry.
So a pretty robust picture of the environmental envelope these organisms need.
Yes, it's a solid representation.
Okay, so here's where it gets really interesting, right? Because the key temporal findings, how these niches changed over time, seem to fundamentally challenge that core assumption of stability we started with.
The results are quite sobering for predictability, frankly. Let's talk about stability, that key overlap component. They found it remained consistently low, really low. On average, across all 778 species, the niche overlap stability never exceeded 20%, even after 200 years of the species being established somewhere new.
Wait, let me just process that implication for, say, management. If stability is only 20% on average, does that mean if you build a predictive model today based only on where the species lives in its native range, that model is basically wrong, or at least incomplete 80% of the time when trying to predict where it is or will be in the introduced range?
That is the profound and quite concerning implication. Models that rely only on those historical native niches are likely to largely fail at predicting the ranges of introduced marine species within those policy-relevant timeframes, decades. The historical niche just doesn't seem to be a reliable map for the future invasion.
Wow, okay. So if stability is consistently low, what is driving the pattern? You mentioned unfilling was high, especially for the more recent invasions.
Yes, exactly. For species that have been invading for less than about a century, something like 2/3 of their overall global niche was actually unfilling.
Meaning they haven't yet spread to all the suitable places.
Right. They haven't reached their full habitat potential in the new regions. And while unfilling did tend to decrease over time, as you'd expect, it still generally remained high, over 50% of the global niche, even after 200 years for many species groups.
Okay, but what about where they first land? The study measured something called centroid deviation, right? Which is like the distance between the best environment back home and where they actually start out in the new range. I would intuitively expect that distance to be small initially, like they find a good spot right away.
Well, the finding was actually the opposite. That centroid deviation, the mismatch between the native niche center and the initial introduced niche center, was highest for the most recent invaders.
Highest. So they start out further away from their ideal native condition.
Exactly. And this strongly supports that idea we discussed earlier, that initial establishment is often more about propagal pressure, about where human activity drops them, rather than landing in the perfect environmental spot. They land somewhere, maybe suboptimal, and then they have to scramble, adapt, or expand from there.
And that expansion part is happening too, isn't it? The E component?
Yes. Expansion generally increased over time, and perhaps most tellingly, expansion consistently contributed a higher proportion of the overall global niche than stability did.
So they're more likely to be found in new types of environments than in ones that match their old home.
On average, yes. The study suggests marine invaders are roughly 20% more likely to initially show up in these new, novel environments compared to environments that closely match their historical niche. They're breaking the rules right from the start, which, as you can imagine, severely complicates trying to predict their spread in the marine world.
Okay, so let's zoom out. What does this all mean for the big picture of invasion science? We have this huge study showing predictability in marine systems is fundamentally low. Does this mean marine invaders are different? Different from invaders on land?
The contrast appears to be quite significant, yes. It really points towards a major difference between biomes. Other large syntheses that have looked at terrestrial invasions, plants, insects, land vertebrates, they've often found much higher stability, sometimes over 50% overlap.
50% on land versus less than 20% in the sea. That's a stark difference. It really is. And it's probably the core takeaway here. The patterns, the dynamics of niche change, seem to differ strongly between marine and terrestrial systems. So why? Why is the ocean apparently so much harder to predict? Why do terrestrial species seem to stick closer to their old environmental rules while marine species just kind of veer off into new territory?
Well, a leading hypothesis is that it boils down to ecological novelty and the breakdown of historical biotic interactions. Meaning, in terrestrial systems, niche models might work better, partly because some core biotic constraints, maybe specific soil microbes, key plant competitors, specialized predators are still present or similar in the new range, keeping the species somewhat confined to its historical niche.
Okay.
But in the ocean, when a species gets transported, often across vast distances, it frequently lands in a place completely devoid of its specialized predators, competitors, or diseases from back home. It's like hitting a blank ecological slate.
Ah, the enemy release hypothesis.
Exactly. This enemy release potentially allows the species to immediately start using resources or tolerating conditions that it was historically excluded from, simply because of competition or predation pressure in its native community.
So without those old biological guardrails, the species' potential niche based on its physiology becomes much broader, leading to more expansion and less stability compared to its historical niche.
That's the idea. You seem to have much higher levels of this effective ecological novelty in marine invasions, making prediction based solely on the old abiotic environmental conditions, like temperature and salinity, much less reliable.
Fascinating. Okay, so the biome matters hugely, but the study also showed that within the marine realm, context still matters, right? Like where the species moves from and to, and what kind of organism it is. Let's touch on those latitudinal effects first.
Yes, the geography of the invasion pathway was really important. They found that species invading from high latitudes towards low latitudes, so moving from colder regions towards the biodiverse tropics, those species experienced the highest levels of unfilling.
Highest unfilling moving towards the tropics. Why would that be?
Well, it's consistent with the idea of stronger biotic resistance in the tropics. Those highly diverse tropical communities might have more intense competition and predation pressure, essentially pushing back against the invader, preventing it from occupying all the environmentally suitable habitats. Hence, lots of unfilling potential niche space left empty.
Okay, that makes sense. And what about the other way? Invading from low latitudes to high latitudes, like from the tropics towards the poles. There, they saw the opposite pattern. Greater expansion and also greater stability. More expansion and stability moving towards the poles.
Yeah, which fits perfectly with that enemy release idea again. At higher latitudes, the native communities might be simpler, maybe less saturated with competitors. So invaders arriving there might face weaker biotic resistance. This allows them to hold on to their historical niche more easily, hence higher stability, but also gives them more opportunity to expand into new environmental space that might have been unavailable back home due to competition.
So practically speaking, if you're trying to manage risk, say in the Arctic, you might have a slightly better shot at predicting the niche of an invader coming from the tropics than the other way around.
Based on these findings, potentially, yes. The predictability seems context-dependent.
And there were taxonomic differences too, right? You mentioned fishes earlier stood out.
They did. Fishes, compared to algae and invertebrates in the study, showed the highest unfilling, but also the lowest stability and expansion.
That seems a bit counterintuitive. Fish can generally move further and faster. You'd think they could expand more easily.
It is an interesting contradiction. The thinking is that despite their dispersal ability, fish might be more tightly constrained in other ways, perhaps stricter physiological limits needing very specific temperature or salinity windows, or maybe they face more intense competition for specific habitats or resources from native fishes already there.
So those constraints limit their ability to both maintain their old niche, low stability, and colonize truly novel environments, low expansion, leading to more unfilling.
That seems to be the interpretation, yes.
And what about the smaller organisms, the algae and invertebrates? They showed more expansion and stability.
Generally, yes. They might benefit from things like greater ecological flexibility, maybe higher physiological plasticity, often associated with smaller body size and shorter generation times. Plus, think about their reproductive strategies. Some algae reproduce asexually. Many invertebrates have larval stages perfectly suited for transport.
And how they get moved around matters too.
Crucially, algae and invertebrates are prime candidates for transport via things like ship hull biofouling or in ballast water. This can move them vast distances very efficiently, potentially giving them access to a wider range of initial environmental conditions right from the start, which could facilitate greater overall expansion compared to fish, which might disperse more gradually.
Okay. Given the massive scale and the historical nature of this data, let's just briefly touch on the study's limitations again, just to be thorough.
Sure. The authors are upfront about them. As we discussed, relying on historical records always carries the potential for observational bias patchiness in sampling, especially in less accessible regions or earlier time periods. And the other main point is using present-day environmental data specifically, the average conditions from 2000 to 2014, to estimate the niches for species that might have been introduced centuries ago.
Because the environment itself has changed over 200 years.
Exactly. Using a modern average simplifies the actual historical environmental conditions the species encountered. It's a necessary simplification for such a large-scale study, but it could introduce some noise or uncertainty into the precise niche estimates for those early invaders. Understood. But despite those limitations, the overall signal seems pretty clear and quite strong. Relying solely on historical niche models for predicting marine invasions is, well, risky business. It probably won't work well on its own. That's the unavoidable conclusion, yes.
So where does the research need to go now? How do we build better predictive tools for marine invasions in light of these findings?
Well, the study strongly suggests an immediate need for developing more integrative models. We need approaches that don't just look at the environmental niche, but explicitly combine that with robust data on propagule pressure.
Because how species arrive is just as important as where they could live.
Precisely. Since that initial landing seems so heavily influenced by human transport patterns, we simply can't ignore that stochastic, human-driven factor. We also need to get beyond just correlating patterns with environmental variables. We need more experimental work.
Like what kind of experiments?
Things like common garden experiments or reciprocal transplants, where you actually move species between native and introduced ranges under controlled conditions. These can help us understand the specific mechanisms driving niche expansion. Is it release from enemies? Is it rapid adaptation? And crucially, we need to better link specific life history traits of species like reproductive rate, dispersal mode, physiological tolerance to the magnitude of niche change they exhibit.
So we can start predicting which types of species are most likely to break the niche stability rules.
Exactly. Moving towards a more mechanistic understanding. So I think the final takeaway for you listening is this. If you're involved in managing marine invasion risks, any predictions based only on models using the species' historical distribution need to be viewed with, let's say, extreme caution. The consistently low stability they found over 200 years strongly suggests we might often be fighting yesterday's battle, predicting where the species used to fit, not where it is or is going.
And the key is context.
Absolutely. The context, the biome, marine versus terrestrial, the specific geography of the invasion pathway, and the type of organism involved seems absolutely critical for understanding whether and where our predictions might actually hold water.
That really leads to a fascinating, maybe slightly provocative final thought for you to chew on. If niche stability breaks down so dramatically for invasive species, these organisms that are clearly adapting rapidly, expanding their tolerances into novel environments, what might that imply for native marine species? Especially those trying to cope with rapidly shifting climate conditions. It seems like their historically stable niches could be under massive pressure too, doesn't it?
That's a very sobering thought, and likely a topic for another deep dive.
Indeed. Well, thank you for joining us for this deep dive today.